Welcome to another Dr. Sadler's Honest Book Review, the book that I am reviewing today, which I'm very happy about, and by the way, I highly recommend, is by a friend and colleague of mine, Chakrapani, and it's very recent. It came out this year. It's called The Power to Change, subtitled Stoic Strategies to Transform Your Life. And just to give you a little bit of a preview, I'll give you something up front. This may be the best introduction to Stoicism that I have come across in my many years of looking at contemporary literature on Stoicism, particularly for the ordinary person, the non-academic. So if you don't know about this series, let me tell you a little bit about it, and then we'll jump right into the book review. So Sadler's Honest Book Reviews. The honest part, unvarnished. I give you the good, the bad, the ugly, and some of the key ideas, all of that stuff. And it's focused on philosophy books in a very broad sense, so it can include actual academic philosophy, but oftentimes strays into areas like applied ethics, self-help, personal development, leadership, various other fields as well, philosophy of emotion being a notable example. And so what I do with each of these reviews is I tell you, as somebody who's an expert delving into the book, exactly what you can expect of it, so you can decide whether you want to invest the time and perhaps money getting and reading the book. So let's jump into the review of Chakrapani's The Power to Change. I always like to begin by highlighting the three big S's: the style of the work, the structure, and giving kind of a summary. So I'm going to give the summary first. I think it actually is there in the title, The Power to Change. You can indeed change if you have the right tools and the right motivation. And it's, subtitled Stoic Strategies to Transform Your Life. And, that is kind of a big claim: transform your life, not just improve your life. We'll talk about that a bit in, down the line. But Stoic strategies. The Stoics offer us resources. The key is figuring out what they are and how to use them. So the book is essentially set up to harness Stoic ideas and practices so that you can work upon yourself. But I like the emphasis on life. It's not just working on yourself, it's also working on how you relate to other people, the world, all of your engagements with it. So I think that's a good summary of what the work intends to do and actually does pull off. Let's talk about the style. It's pretty simple to talk about that. Chuck is a great author. He's been writing for a long time. This is not his first book on Stoicism, by the way. And, his writing is very accessible, but still has some bite and rigor to it, like the ancient Stoics who we look at. So he's competent, he's informed, but very readable. I think, I intend actually to give this to a family member and pass it on to them because I think it's such an accessible work. The book has four main parts, and he tells you what these are in the very beginning of the work. Part one explores the core Stoic principles and their potential for transformative change. Part two addresses common obstacles that may hinder the implementation of these principles. Part three guides you in designing a life that flows smoothly and harmoniously. Part four provides practical strategies for navigating and overcoming everyday challenges. And I should point out that those strategies are not coming only in part four. They're throughout the entire work in a lot of different ways. And if we look at the overall titles of parts 1 through 4, I think that gives us a good idea as well. So part 1 is titled where are we headed? What's our goal, right? Part 2, what are we up against? So those obstacles. Part 3, how to design a life that flows well. That's very similar to his description. And then part 4, how to handle everyday problems, many of which are going to turn out to be dealing with particular emotions that the Stoics can help us with. When we look at each chapter belonging to each part, what we find is there's first going to be a several page, anywhere from like 2 to 5 page exposition of a key idea or set of ideas with some supporting quotations from classic Stoic texts. And then there'll be a takeaway section, which, I mean, if you're a really impatient person, which probably is something you need to work on, you can go right to that, and he's going to give you several lines of summary of what the chapter's about. Actually, if you really demand that sort of thing, I suppose you could read that part in advance. And then each concludes with some practical exercise or exercises that are connected to that particular set of ideas. So that's basically the structure. I mean, we do have a few other things. There's, a foreword. He ends with some gratitude for the people who made the book happen. There's a short references and some final thoughts about the whole work itself, but the bulk of it is exactly what I've described. So that's our style, structure, and summary. What are the key ideas of this work? There's a lot in here, and I'm not going to tell you every single one of them because I'd like you to actually explore it for yourself. But I'll start with one that I think is really major. Chuck stresses something that, he's not the first person to come up with this. The classical Stoics do as well. But there's understanding ideas. That's great. And you can't do without that. You can't just jump into Stoic practice without actually knowing what you're doing. But understanding ideas is not the same as putting them into practice. So he stresses, and these are his own words, that consistent application is crucial. Consistent, right? You got to do this day after day after day. And not just, do it once and then hope it's going to transform your life. And then this is actually crucial. And again, jibes perfectly with the ancient Stoics. You'll find Epictetus stressing this over and over again. You can read all the Chrysippus you want, but unless you've actually done the work applying those ideas, it's not much help to you. So that's one key thing. Another thing that I already mentioned is Chuck uses the word transform, rather than simply improve, or, we could pick other words as well. Stoicism, as a practical philosophy, does have the capacity to not just improve incrementally, but to transform your life, to change your perspective in fundamental ways, to result in being a happier and freer person. And that's what this book is designed to do. It's not just designed to help you fix a few things here and there. This is kind of a guidebook. It's not going to do everything for you, but that's the goal. And I think that's great that it's doing that. The parts 1 through 4. So we already talked about what these are about, but we could do a little bit of a deeper dive. And, looking at the chapter headings can be helpful for this. So part 1 is about figuring out, where are you trying to go? So, figuring out some Stoic ideas. He talks about the power to change your life. This is a really key one. A lot of people feel helpless, like they can't work on themselves or improve their life. And Stoicism, like all virtue ethics and all philosophies as ways of life, says, no, you can. It's got to be work, but you can do it. He's got this great chapter, which I'm going to talk about later on, actions that shape us, then acts of power, a shortcut to a better life, and finally concluding with seize the day. Now is the time to actually start doing things, not, after New Year's, for example. Part 2 is about obstacles. So what are the obstacles, the things that get in our way? Well, he starts out by talking about the silent systems of our mind. And this is a particularly important idea as well. We are thinking all the time, whether we realize that we're doing so consciously or just doing it implicitly, subconsciously. We've got all sorts of ideas churning away. And a lot of times those ideas are not well connected or founded in reality. So we need to pay attention to that sort of thing. He talks about our grasshopper mind. Sometimes people talk about monkey mind, but grasshopper is another good metaphor. There's a chapter called Junk in Our Mind's Attic. What is the baggage, the clutter that we bring with us? And then there's this great discussion, the quest for more. We need to pay attention to our desires and whether they're actually attainable and where we got them from. Are they really authentically our desires, or did we inherit them, or were they implanted, or did somebody impose them upon us? Then there's this discussion of 4 backseat drivers, and this is actually going to connect with the Stoic virtues because each of these is the contrary of a virtue, one of the 4 vices. He talks about foolishness, excess, cowardice, and injustice. And backseat drivers, if you're not familiar with that metaphor, a backseat driver is somebody who sits in your backseat as you're driving and then tells you what you should or shouldn't do. And you could pay attention to him, or you could turn around and tell him, hey, shut the hell up. I'm the one driving here, right? Part 3, how to design a life that flows well. It's going to give you a number of useful ideas about this, how to not be a perfectionist, appreciating each day, letting go of regrets, which is a very important thing, taking not shortcuts, but don't take long ways just to take long ways, gaining freedoms, our messy lives, again, returning to the topic of our desires and figuring out what's enough for us. And then 2 other things that I think are really important that often don't get enough play in discussions about Stoicism. Finding joy. Stoics should have a joyful life. And being kind to other people, which for the Stoics is an integral part of the virtue of justice. Finally, the last part, how to handle everyday problems. Most of these, as I mentioned, are going to be particular emotions, right? So anger, guilt, anxiety, we're going to come back to those in a bit. But he also talks about the problem of overthinking and the fact that we don't have to do that. And getting up every time we fall is the end of it. A reminder that we are going to fail and we need to figure out how we're going to deal with that. The last part is called Final Thoughts, Let's Not Be Fooled by Simplicity. And I think that's quite an interesting thing as well. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in the What's Good section. So I think that there's some interesting distinctions that are being made in this work that are totally consonant with, and I would say coming out of Stoic philosophy, but we're not actually finding in the Stoic text. So for example, in his discussion of actions, he makes a distinction between 3 categories of actions. What it is that we do willingly, what we do reluctantly, and what we need to do but put off doing, which is one of the things that has to do with virtues. Right? He knows human psychology quite well. I think that's a great distinction there. I really like the part about the backseat drivers being particular vices. I'm going to bring up the section about perfectionism because I think that is a big problem for a lot of people. He says perfectionism paralyzes us. We almost complete things but don't finish them because we're unsure if they're perfect. We stop ourselves from doing things because we won't be perfect enough. We postpone things indefinitely because we're unsure we can do them perfectly. And we demand perfection from others, and it drives them crazy. And there's this section here about, is there a perfect Stoic? Well, that would be the legendary sage, right? And he says, Stoic perfectionism is a concept, but Stoic sagehood is vanishingly small for all practical purposes. It doesn't exist. And so I think that's a good take on the sage. I also think the section on the messiness of our lives, which sometimes, people tie that together with perfectionism. So the very beginning of this, the messy and the magnificent, right? And he's got this, little story that he's telling about this guy who gets, everything that he wants in life and doesn't make him happy. And he's stressing that, our lives are imperfect and in process. And that's okay. The question is what we're going to do with them. I think that there's also, a good discussion about the fact, actually it recurs at several points. You cannot change the past. The past is something that's out of your control. It may not even be all that helpful to think all that much about like what you could have done or should have done or anything like that. So those are some of the key ideas running throughout the work. You're also going to find a lot of specific discussions of particular things, but I don't want to get too bogged down in those details because they're all in short chapters that you can read and appreciate for yourself. What do I find good about this work? So I'm actually going to use a superlative here, or rather a comparative. This is not just a good book, it is a great book. Chuck just hit it out of the park. And that became evident to me when I was only about 30 pages into it. Because I read with a pretty critical eye. And I've done reviews of other books by Chuck Chakrapani where I said, well, it's a good book. There's some things I disagree with here and there. This could have been done better. And, as I was reading through this, I was like, holy crap, this is really extraordinary. So I won't say that it is the best because that's perhaps too strong of a claim, but it's a top tier book for understanding Stoicism. I'm going to pass this on very happily to somebody else. I very strongly recommend that you get a copy of this book because it's really quite awesome. First, I'm actually passing it on to my wife, who hasn't read it yet, who will appreciate it, and then I'm passing it on to another family member. So let's talk about some good points. Chuck has a really solid understanding built up over decades of key Stoic principles, and it really shows in the way that he describes things, the way that he handles things in here. And I think another facet of that, when you really understand a concept well, and you're a good public speaker, which I've seen Chuck do. He's spoken at Stoicon, he teaches classes up in Toronto. One of the things that you get really good at is providing, we could call them examples or analogies or likenesses or applications that help the hearer, the reader, understand what to do with these ideas. This book is full of them, some of which Chuck, I think, came up by himself, some of which he drew from other sources. And, why not? Why reinvent the wheel when you've got good stuff? This book is full of useful, applicable, right out of the box practices that you could do. As a matter of fact, if you were feeling kind of, lazy or impatient and you just wanted to jump to the practices, which I don't recommend, at the end of each chapter and start doing them, you could do that and then see what happens. And then you'd probably want to go and read the chapter to figure out how did this actually work for me. But there's so many in here. This could keep you busy for a year, I would say. The book itself is effectively a guide to not just practices, but an overall fabric, a structure, a way of living, what the Stoics called ascesis, which we often translate as discipline. Chuck prefers the term training. I'm fine with either of those, but it's not just a bunch of disjointed, hey, try a little bit of this, a little bit of this. It's a comprehensive fabric. It doesn't cover every single possible thing, of course, but it covers enough, I would say. One of the other things I really like about the book is that, and this is a problem with a lot of contemporary introduce you to Stoic literature, Some of it doesn't talk much about the virtues at all. Chuck is definitely making the virtues front and center in this work. He's connecting them over and over again with other key Stoic concepts, which I think is absolutely important because Stoicism is a system, not just a bunch of sound bites or quips and quotes or anything like that. So the virtues are absolutely central for any authentic understanding of Stoicism, and Chuck is doing a pretty good job in making sure that we know what the virtues are, how they apply, where we need them, what we need to do with them. I actually really like the analysis of regret, which is something that people ask about a lot in Stoic forums. They actually ask me about that sometimes when I'm doing like an AMA. So there's actually an entire chapter devoted to the notion of regret. And he says, regret is the flip side of anxiety. Anxiety is about what might happen in the future, which is yet undetermined. Regret is even worse because it's about what already happened in the past, which has been decided. There's nothing you can do about the past. And he says it's a way in which we look back at the past and then introduce all these terms like should, would, could, right? Things that are counterfactual, things that don't exist. And we're playing with the past in our imagination and our emotions in a way that doesn't serve us. He also says, be gentle with yourself. You did the best you could in the situation. I mean, maybe if you were who you are now or after reading through the book, you could have done better, but past you was a screw up, screwed up like that. The other thing he points out that I think is great is, let's say you could go back and change the past. You wouldn't be you anymore. There's a paradox involved there. So that's a great chapter there. I like his stress on dealing with real life issues and situations. I also think it's great that he places a stress on the importance of actually feeling joy. If you were to be a Stoic and do things and you didn't feel joy, the classic Stoics would say somehow you're doing it wrong. And that's where I think a lot of contemporary people go wrong. They take all the cold showers and do the voluntary hardship, and they're like, why does my life feel good? Well, you're doing Stoicism wrong. There's something off there. So the other emotions that he's going to talk about, which I think he's got some great analyses here. So anger, of course, and taking offense or insults, the feeling of guilt, which also doesn't serve us, anxiety and fear. One that he talks about as well is the sense of helplessness. And he says this is the opposite of confidence in things. Maybe helplessness is like what we traditionally call despair. He also talks about a certain kind of desire for other people's approval. That's important as well. And then he talks about, there's 2 chapters that are titled not in terms of emotions, but in terms of things that other people do which could provoke emotions on our part. And they're things we're going to run into in ordinary life sooner or later. One of them is ingratitude. Ingratitude on the part of other people. How should we deal with what it feels like to have other people be ungrateful to us? The other is betrayal. This, I think, is absolutely important because too many people, their idea of Stoicism is, I will be this impermeable, invincible, invictus thing. Nobody shall shake me. And that's not really Stoicism. That's something stoicoid, right? Or that's fake Stoicism. You're going to have to deal with people disappointing you, and not just disappointing you, screwing you over. How are you going to address that? You don't have to pretend like what they did isn't wrong. That's not Stoic. So I think these are some really good strengths, some things I really like about this particular short book. I guess it wouldn't be a Sadler's Honest Review if I didn't find some things to bring up and criticize, and they are actually legitimate, but they're, you know, there's three that I have, and I would say that two of these are kind of quibble level. So let's talk about those first. There is a claim about Seneca's Letter 16, which I don't think is entirely founded. I think Chuck goes a little bit further than Seneca does, in part because he is telling us about two kinds of desires, right? He says that Seneca is going to distinguish between natural wants, desires of needs, and desires of opinions, desires of wants. Seneca doesn't use that language, actually. Wants, needs. He does use the term desire, but he doesn't talk about it in that way. He does talk about natural and opinion, but the wants and needs thing, that's going a little bit far with that. But again, a quibble. Another thing that some of you might be like, don't worry about that at all. Chuck uses probably the most famous quote from Friedrich Nietzsche at one point from The Twilight of the Idols. What does not kill me makes me stronger. That doesn't actually completely express Nietzsche's opinion. It's kind of a misquote. It's using something he says, but the whole aphorism is from the military school of life. So it's not clear that Nietzsche actually endorses that or thinks that we should see things that way. And it's definitely not intended as like a statement about everything, the way that people have done with it, even incorporating it into song lyrics, right? So I don't, I'm not going to say that's wrong or anything. It does actually fit the chapter. The other thing that I think could have been better in the work, and this is really the only real criticism that I have, and it's not that big of a criticism, is so I've talked about that Chuck really focuses on the virtues, and those are prudence or wisdom, practical wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance. And that's absolutely important. That's really good. When it comes to his treatment of prudence and justice, I think Chuck is completely on point. The Stoics talk about courage and temperance in a way, or in ways rather, that have that main virtue and then subordinate virtues of those. So courage is not just about fear. It actually has to do with quite a few emotions, as we know in Cicero's On Duties, Book 1, where Cicero says it also has to do with anger, it has to do with pleasure and pain, it also has to do with desire. But courage is also involved in magnanimity or great-souledness, endurance, something that gets translated as industriousness, literally love of labor or toil. You're not going to find much exploration of courage in this way. Nothing's contradicting that, but it's just not there. Likewise, temperance does include self-control of our bodily desires and appetites and things like that. But really important, temperance also includes two other things. One is a sense of shame or modesty. This is absolutely important in Epictetus, who brings it up over and over again. It's important in Cicero. And it also includes like properly ordering things as well. Kosmiotes in Greek. So that's missing here. But, it's certainly not something that makes the book bad. It's just, sort of things that don't get discussed. Chuck could easily, maybe the second edition will include discussions of those because everything that he's got here is totally compatible with it. So those are the only criticisms that I have of the work. All right, my final thoughts on this. This is a book that I, unqualifiedly recommend. As I said, I think this is among the best of the contemporary, interpretations and applications of Stoicism in the present. I mean, it's really compact, 240 pages, and it is the product, clearly, of not just a lot of labor, but a lot of thinking and rethinking on Chuck's part. And as somebody who knows Chuck, we're not like super close friends, but we've interacted many, many times over the years. This is something where I'm like, man, I'm happy for you and proud of you for doing this. I actually feel what Aristotle calls emulation, where you're like, oh man, this is a book I wish I would have written. It's that good. So I would recommend you get a copy of it. Whether you're like somebody who's just interested in Stoicism, or somebody who's at like a beginner or intermediate level, or somebody like me who has been studying and practicing and even teaching it for, quite a long time, I think you're going to get a lot out of this book. So those are the last things that I have to say. And, just on a personal note, I'm going to say, man, Chuck, great job.